Mead Stampede wrap-up take 2. We just finished up judging for 2021's Mead Stampede Mead Competition, and I learned a lot, including some things I'm going to share with you here that can probably be used to help you win mead competitions. On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to talk about my top 15 takeaways from helping to run a mead competition.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
We just finished wrapping on Mead Stampede, the first ever collaborative mead competition between our channel, Doing the Most, and Man-Made Mead. Big shout out to everyone who helped support it, primarily the committee, including Rob, who helped make this thing happen. Rob, we all really appreciate how much hard work you put into this. Also shout out to Northern Brewer in Homebrew, Ohio for sponsoring Mead Stampede. So I've participated in homebrewing competitions before, like a long time ago, and I'm planning on participating in some coming up in the future. I've never run one, and so this was a totally new experience to me, and I knew I was gonna learn quite a bit. I didn't know how much I was gonna learn coming out of it. How it worked was everything came in. It was all shipped about 2 months ago. I brought it over from our shipping location and stored it in my garage, and then the day before the competition, we pulled it all out, inventoried everything, and anonymized all the bottles with a new label. That way we didn't know who brewed what. And then each mead was judged by 2 to 3 people. And those 2 to 3 people gave notes and gave scores, and then we came together as a group looking at the top scores and our recommendations for what might be best in each category, and we decided which ones were first, second, and third based on an additional round of tasting. Then at the tail end of the competition, we all got together with the ones that were the number 1 in each of the categories, and we made a determination on which was best of show. So throughout the entire thing, we didn't really know anything about what we were tasting beyond the category and a little bit of information that was on each bottle. We tasted through it, made some judgments, looked at the little tiny description if y'all filled that description out to kind of get a better idea of what was in the bottle, and then made a final determination on score. That said, we judged 131 meads over the course of the weekend, but I didn't judge all 131 myself. Everybody judged a percentage of those meads. So that's a little bit about how it worked, and here's a little bit about what I learned throughout the process. Number 1, acid balance in the majority of the meads needed some work. I would say that 95% or more of the meads had some sort of imbalance in the acid, where it was either way too low acid or a majority of the time so tart. And sometimes what would happen is we'd taste 4 or 5 really tart meads in a row to the point where we had to take a break, cleanse our palate, let our tongues recover from how much acid we'd been tasting. It was just a whole lot. Now there were a few super tart meads that worked really well. Those were typically lemon flavored or lime flavored, or in others the sweetness level was balanced enough that it kind of worked itself out. But for me, looking at the sheer number of meads that I tried that were way out of whack in their acid balance, it tells me that the community needs work on that. Number 2, achieving honey forward flavor is difficult. Now, I love a good dry mead, and if you're a regular viewer of the channel, you know that. However, there were a lot of meads this weekend that could have really benefited from more honey flavor, and sometimes that means more honey sweetness. And even though I really like a nice dry mead, I still want there to be honey character there. And if it's going to benefit the balance, whether the balance of acid or the balance of tannin, to increase the sweetness, even if just marginally, it's okay to do that if it makes a better product. Even if you don't love a sweet mead, just a touch of sweetness might be all it takes to bring that balance to the next level. We had several dry meads this weekend that just didn't hit. And on several, I left notes saying, hey, just a little bit of sweetness might have completely changed the experience I had here. Number 3, and piggybacking on that, it is important to make a conscious decision about why you're using honey and why you're making it a mead instead of a wine. Honey is floral, honey is thick, and those are the 2 main things that it contributes when you're making a mead. It's contributing florals, those flower petal, pollen-y kind of aromatics, and a lot of times, especially when back sweetening, it's providing viscosity. It's providing thick, rich mouthfeel. If you're not getting both of those, or at least one or the other, there's a little bit of a question about why honey was used as the fermentable sugar, because if honey doesn't bring something to the table, there's kind of no reason for that product to be a mead. It might be that instead of using honey as the fermentable sugar, since you're not getting any of the benefit of having honey in there, that it would be wiser and cheaper to use simple sugar and invert the simple sugar so you have glucose and fructose just like you would with honey, without paying out for all the nuance and complexity that comes with honey. And I say this as somebody who loves making mead. But at the end of the day, if I'm not tasting anything or sensing anything that tells me honey's in there, I kind of wonder why this wasn't just made as a country fruit wine. Number 4, often aroma and flavor are just really far apart. And I experienced this with one mead where we opened it and the whole space just perfumed with this incredible aroma. Like you could smell it across the room. But then tasting it, it was just kind of okay. It wasn't bad, but it was in no way what the aroma told us that it was going to be. And I don't have a lot of feedback on how to fix that. It was just something that was really interesting to me, how there were several times we would open a bottle and it would taste totally different than it smelled. Sometimes the aroma would be excellent and the flavor would be middling, or vice versa. It was just a really interesting experience to sometimes taste a mead where the nose and the palate were just totally different. Number 5, Braggots are difficult to pull off and underrepresented. This was just really interesting to me. I thought we would have more Braggots in the competition, and we didn't. And the ones that we had, for the most part, were kind of average. Pulling off that malty character when you've got honey in there drying the beer out is tough, and it was interesting comparing the few that we had to each other. A lot of the feedback seemed to be that it wasn't malty enough or rich enough to carry the honey flavor forward. I would like to see more Braggots next time around. Number 6, the Melomel is the most forgiving category. Particularly in judging, there was a lot of discussion and debate around whether or not Melomels provided a little bit of cover for other faults that might be in there. And it was never used as a way to dock somebody on points, but it was definitely used as a way to try and make determinations around best of show. Particularly when you have one style that is a little bit more bare, a little bit more naked than a Melomel, stacked up against a really good Melomel, you have to say, okay, both of these are 99s out of 100, but which one eked it out from an execution standpoint better? Which one was more difficult to achieve than the other? And this wasn't obviously sole judging criteria, but it was definitely an interesting thing to me to taste through so many different kinds of meads throughout the weekend, but for there to consistently be seemingly better Melomels than any of the other categories. And I feel like the reason there are more standouts in the fruited category is because our human palates love sweet, jammy fruit. It's evolutionary, right? You're out hunting and gathering and picking fresh, delicious berries, and that hit of dopamine, that candy kind of aspect is really alluring if that's a really rare experience. I think thinking about it from that mindset applied to this mead competition, obviously these big, fruity, jammy meads are going to seem a lot more excellent than the more difficult to pull off categories. Number 7, fruit quantity matters, folks. Now, particularly when I'm having a mead that's listed as a blueberry melomel, and it tastes a little bit like a cider that might have some blueberries whiff by, that tells me that there wasn't enough fruit in there to really pull it off. And if something is declared as a tropical mead and I can't really pick out a fruit, but it tastes fruity and it tastes tropical, I guess I have a little bit more leniency for that. But if you say this is a papaya, coconut, mango, banana mead, and I don't really pick up any of that in there, maybe it even tastes a little bit like a yeast funky traditional, that also doesn't speak to me as well executed. And fruit is expensive, typically. I get that, and I've tried to cheap out in the past, and there are some ways, particularly with session meads, where you can cheap out on your fruit quantity. But in a lot of our fruited meads, the make or break really seemed to be how much fruit was there to stack up against the honey. Fruit quantity matters. Number 8, yeast selection is still under considered and still important. I've mentioned this in past videos about how yeast selection is actually important, And in experiencing a lot of meads this weekend that didn't have a lot of nuance or intrigue layered in there, a lot of times I found myself writing a note at the bottom recommending maybe a different yeast strain, or maybe a yeast strain that's got something that's going to complement what's in the mead as a way to help kind of stack some of those elements together. And it's difficult to kind of suss out what yeast contributed to a brew, but it's also fairly easy to know when the yeast didn't really contribute anything to the brew. And for that reason, it kind of almost makes me want to ask what yeast was selected next year. So that way I have a better understanding of what kind of strategy went into concocting that recipe, and a better understanding of what recommendations I could make toward yeast selection in a rebrew of that mead. Number 9, and this is a simple one, wildflower and clover honey were almost exclusively the honeys used in this competition, with orange blossom honey kind of picking up the rear. Now, there were a few other honey varietals throughout, and those often tended to be the more interesting meads, and probably my favorite mead that I had of the weekend used a honey varietal I'd never even heard of. Going forward, it would be really fun to see more honey varietals represented throughout the breadth of the meads in the competition. Number 10, there was a notable number of re-fermented meads marked as still. Bottle bombs are fine for your home if you take the proper precautions and nobody gets hurt, but sending bottle bombs to a competition is not a great look. We had one bottle that nearly shot Man-Made Mead's eye out as the cap flew past him and into the ceiling fan, and from that point on, we decided not to trust anything that looked or sounded questionable, and we opened a lot of your meads outside on the front porch, and that was a good thing because we had several of them overflow. Bottle bombs are dangerous and can hurt someone, and if you've marked a mead as still, it should be still when it arrives at the competition, even if you have to pasteurize or stabilize that thing. Nearly as big as the safety concerns is the judging concerns over this, because if you've exploded a mead on us and we're mopping it up off the dining room table, we are unlikely to be able to view that mead with an unbiased lens during the judging. Don't shoot yourself in the foot at competitions. Don't let your meads re-ferment in the bottle. Number 11, screw caps may be convenient, but they leak. Many of the screw-capped bottles that we received this week leaked. One set leaked so bad that we were unable to even judge the mead due to spoilage. Use a corker, use a capper, and for some of you, check that bell on your capper because we had some caps that were also not well sealed and bottles that leaked or leaked out entirely in transit through the cap. To that point, number 12, please package things well when sending them to others. I was actually stunned by some of the packaging we saw. Some was really excellent, and we're actually going to give out an award to someone for the best packaging because we did have some really impressively packaged meads that were never going to crack, never going to leak. We also had some that were just bizarre, really interesting choices as far as like lack of packaging material in with loose bottles, kind of rattling around in there. The bees have spent a lot of time making the honey, and you have spent a lot of time, blood, sweat, and maybe sometimes tears making your mead. The last thing you want is for it to arrive destroyed. So please package your meads well. And I am going to do a video on this in the future because I learned some new best practices, and I think it's important that we all understand just how important it is to package these things well. Number 13, some of y'all make some exquisite mead. And honestly, you should be very proud. Even if your scorecard comes back and your scores are in the 20s, that's really only being scored as needs improvement. You can't look at it like a report card where 20s would be in the failing territory. And if your score came back and it was in the 30s, that should be considered not too shabby. That's really just needing a little bit more of something or a little bit less of something to have an exceptional product. You should be really proud if you scored in the 30s. If you scored in the 40s, that's really exceptional. You did really, really well, honestly. We consistently raved when we had one where we came to a consensus that it was in the 40s, and sometimes that involved pouring extra glasses for other people to try because we were so excited about it. Anything in the 40s was a real stunner, and only a few of our entries scored under the 20s, just a couple. And I am not blaming the mead maker for that, at least not personally. If it scored that low, there was a sense among the group that something must have went wrong, that it wouldn't have been sent in if it had those faults presenting. And so we're not really judging the mead maker on those meads that came in that just really were difficult to consume or difficult to judge, because something seems to have happened there in transit or after bottling. But if you scored under the 20s, please don't take that personally. That's not us making a critique of you. It's just that's what was presented to us, and that's what we were able to taste. It's really, when you're dealing with all of these conditions, shipping and storage, and not knowing how it was handled in transit, every now and then it's luck of the draw that something went wrong with a bottle. Our whole goal in scoring these things was to help provide valuable feedback so that we can all improve together. Number 14, blunt feedback can be hard. It can be hard to receive, and it particularly can be very difficult to give. There were a few times where I was having a real struggle tasting or consuming a mead, and I would consult with the other judges about how bad it felt to give negative feedback on something that somebody's poured a lot of their time and energy into. And so if you are one of the fortunate folks who gets a scorecard from me, please understand that bluntness is just kind of how I live my life, and I don't mean any of my blunt feedback to be rude or condescending or personal. Again, these were anonymized, and I was just experiencing the weekend. It can be really tough to be hypercritical of something that somebody has spent a lot of time on. And so when it came to a point where we were, as judges, having a consensus on a fairly low score, there was a lot of conversation about what we could say toward needed improvement, or how we could make sure that we were also acknowledging the positives within the bottle. And while I can't promise to remember what I tasted in your brew, if you have questions about a scorecard that came from me, feel free to email me. I would love to go back and try and figure out what it was that you had sent and try and help provide even more helpful feedback on that brew. Because really the point of this is for us to help provide feedback as well as enjoy some of the things that you've created. Usually on my score sheets, I would try and provide some kind of helpful feedback at the end, even if it was dial back on this, or maybe try and add some of that, or maybe try this other yeast, things like that. But man, it was just really difficult sometimes to be super blunt about things that just weren't hitting. And finally, number 15, let's just talk again about underrepresented categories. We had mostly fruited meads. That was really what was happening this weekend, and I get that because, again, like I said earlier, who doesn't love fruit and honey? But I would love to see next time more Acerglens, more Coffee Mells, more Braggots, more Bochet's even. I'd love to get some Rotomels in the mix. I don't think I tasted a single Rotomel this weekend. And hell, I'd even be interested in the experimental category to try some Oxymels. I don't know, like a balsamic vinegar strawberry fruit bomb Melomel might be interesting, something like that. I would really just like to see more representation of the different styles of mead across the entire competition. And I get why it was the way it is. If you're submitting to competition and you're paying to be a part of something and you're hoping to win an award, you're really wanting to send something that really smacks of mead and what mead is, and a lot of times that's going to be a traditional, or it's going to be something with a lot of fruit. But if there was like a Braggot in there that just really blew me away, or again a Rotomel that just blew my mind, I could have been very easily convinced to advocate for pushing that through if it was executed really well, just because it was something we weren't getting a lot of. And there was a tendency to really celebrate the unusual brews that were done well and share them with the rest of the judges. So that's my top 15 takeaways from this weekend of running Mead Stampede. Again, big shout out to Rob and the committee and everyone who helped make this possible. And again, a big thanks to our sponsors, Northern Brewer and Homebrew Ohio, for coming in and throwing their support behind this as well. And finally, a really big thanks to everyone who believed in Mead Stampede and sent your stuff in and were willing to ride this ride with us and see where it was going to go and accept our feedback, love it or hate it. I think the judges had a great time. I think there was definitely agreement that we need to do it again next year. And we're going to take a look at what it would take to make sure this is a BJCP sanctioned tournament next time around. So hopefully we can make that happen. But really big thank you to the community for supporting Mead Stampede. I think it was a huge success. I learned a lot. Y'all are going to have some interesting notes where hopefully you will learn a lot from us. And we're trying to make sure that this is a really open and data-driven mead competition. So in the future, look for more information from us about what we saw this weekend. I'm hoping to work with Rob to build some interesting graphs so we can kind of visually represent the data from this week. So stay tuned for all of that. And if you're watching this when the video releases, we have yet to announce any of our winners or put out our scorecards. Just know that we're working on finishing that up before the end of July 2021. Follow us on the social medias, join the Discord. We love and appreciate you. Thank you for making this a successful Mead Stampede 2021, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Why would you do this to me?
Just check it out. Don't eat it. Just check it out. And so you see how bitter it is and tannic?
Yeah?
Yeah. So that's structure. What have we been talking about this whole time? Structure.